Och i denna tillfälle så har vi två eminenta herrar all the way from the UK som kommer att presentera en studie som handlar om Programmatic Supply Chain Technology Study och Transparency. Det vill säga, vad är det som händer från en investering hela vägen ut till konsumentexponering. Och med oss har vi Sam Tomlinson, partner på PwC in the UK, och vi har Steven Chester som är Director of Media på det motsvarande organet till Sveriges annonsörer fast i UK. Take it away.
We want to talk about a study which we commissioned over 2 years ago at ISBA to look at the programmatic supply chain. And I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for that, and then I'll pass to Sam from PwC, who will talk about the results and the findings from the study. So we looked 2 years ago at how we could help advertisers understand more about the programmatic supply chain. And in typical annual planning, where we asked members what we should focus on for the year, the programmatic supply chain and finding out more about how it works was top of their agenda. And specifically, they have more understanding of the programmatic supply chain, but not necessarily who is in the supply chain and how much they cost. So we wanted to try to build on previous studies that looked at this already, rather than replicating simply having a UK version of existing studies. And we took inspiration from the WFA's, the World Federation of Advertisers study in 2014, and the ANA's Programmatic Fog study in 2017. And the WFA study looked essentially at the programmatic supply chain and actually how it worked and having a better understanding of it by delving more into it, its function, its benefits. And as part of that, they looked at the cost of each stage of the journey through the supply chain. And that was really just a sort of groundbreaking study that helped people to understand, if I spend €1, how many cents actually gets to the publisher essentially as working media. And then 3 years later, our cousins, the Association of National Advertisers in America, actually created a study where they had a forensic look at the supply chain, so they could follow the money from the advertiser as far through the supply chain as possible. And they got as far as the advertising exchange, but because they only had buy-side data, they had to estimate the amount of money actually landing with the publisher because they didn't have SSP costs. In both studies, it showed that there were significant costs in the supply chain because of the number of parties in the supply chain. And the WFA study showed that 40 cents in the euro essentially arrived at the publisher as working media. And the ANA study showed a slightly improved position at just over 50 pence or 50 cents in the euro actually arriving with the publisher. So we wanted to build on these great studies, and we very quickly settled on the notion, the idea of actually working with publishers, so we could actually look at the money going into the supply chain, the money coming out. So we partnered with the Publisher Association in the UK, the Association of Online Publishers, and we quickly settled on PricewaterhouseCoopers as a very clearly as a world-class auditing company, but also they had experience in this, having worked with publishers in the past and actually assessing their own supply chains privately and actually looking at their own programmatic supply chains. So to be clear, what we looked at here were disclosed supply chains. This is where advertisers have the right to audit with advertising agencies, not non-disclosed. So we're looking at about £2 billion of open display market revenue. And the big story here, as Sam will touch on, was really about access to data and the quality of that data that actually allows end-to-end auditing. But I'll let Sam touch on that in a moment. And the purpose of the study was not to name and shame, was not to try and deliver an expose of the programmatic supply chain. We are fans of programmatic buying, as are PwC, but we think it can be better and it needs to be more transparent in terms of its costs. So essentially, the base of this was really just to say, give advertisers an understanding of who's in their supply chain, how much they cost. And really, what we're looking at both in Europe and the UK is strong regulatory scrutiny of the supply chain. And so we think there is motivation for the industry to get behind the findings from the study and how we can carry forward those findings to make programmatic even better. And I'll let Sam touch on the specific findings and how we're going to do that in just a moment.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Tomlinson, partner at PwC, where I lead our marketing and media assurance team. And what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about the team that did this work. Then after that, I will share the slides on screen and talk you through the study methodology, the challenges, and the findings. So just to tell you a bit about the team, we had three main types of skills. in this team people like myself. I'm a qualified accountant and qualified auditor. We had people from a programmatic background led by Paddy Turley, who spent 10 years in ad tech before he joined PwC. And we had our marketing and media data scientists led by Laura Schramm. So we knew we had the right skills of audit plus programmatic plus data science. We also knew that joining up programmatic supply chains from end to end could be done. We've done it once before on a much smaller scale, where we helped an individual publisher buy their own ad inventory anonymously to see how much of that spend got through to them as revenue. What we hadn't anticipated in this study was the major challenges that we would face with data access and data quality. So if you take one thing away from the presentation when I start to share the slides, it's this. It's that urgent need for industry-wide collaboration on an international scale to improve standards of data access and data quality, because only then will supply chains become transparent and auditable. Turning to the study itself, we'll start with a reminder of who participated in this study. So this was a UK study. We had 15 major advertisers coordinated by the UK advertiser trade body ISBA, 12 premium publishers coordinated by their body, the AOP. The agencies and the DSPs that took part were a function of the advertisers that signed up, and the SSPs were a function of the publishers. One important point to note, we had Google as DSP, that's DV360, and Google as SSP, that's Ad Manager. All the other tech vendors for this study were on one side or the other, but not both. We faced numerous challenges with this study, and I'm going to focus in on two of them. The first was what we've called chicken and egg permissioning, and this was at the heart of the data access challenges. So typically what happened when the publishers signed up was they said to us, hey, PwC, we have theoretical contractual rights to log level data, log level meaning individual impression level. So we have theoretical contractual rights to log level data from our SSPs, but we've never asked for it. We don't know how to ingest or filter it or share it with you. Couldn't you just get that direct from the SSP? When we got to the SSP, they all said, oh, that's a bit awkward because our arrangement with the DSP means we can only share this information with our client, the publisher, not with a publisher's representative, which is what you are, PwC. And this is where it starts to get complicated. For our study, this meant we had 6 SSPs, each going separately to 5 DSPs, each with a slightly different permission or contract variation or legal request. So that's immediately 30 sets of permissioning chains. Each of those DSPs then went to the agency trading desks that bought the impressions, who went to their parent agency, who went to the end advertiser. By which point the advertisers are saying, well, of course we want to share this data. We set the study up and funded it 9 months ago and can't figure out why not much has happened since. And I understand that individually, each component of the supply chain is behaving rationally, but you end up with a systemically irrational result. Because if advertisers and publishers want to access and share their data, that should take a few days. It should not take 9 months. The other real major challenge was what we've called data formatting and fidelity on the screen, which is another way of saying data quality. We already knew there was no unique transaction ID that allows you to match an impression from buy side to sell side with certainty. What we hadn't anticipated was all the different data definitions, taxonomies, the fact that some tech vendors find it either very hard or impossible to filter and share log level data. They all have different retention policies and so on. And as I said in my introduction, it's these challenges around data access and data quality that are absolutely critical if programmatic supply chains are to become transparent and auditable. An overview of the methodology. So having overcome those data access challenges, we collected impressions for the period 1st of January 2020 to 20th of March 2020. These were UK impressions only. On the buy side, we collected 1.3 billion impressions from the 15 advertisers' DSPs. of which 267 million were served through our study tech vendors to our study publishers. And our job was to match each of those 267 million impressions from buy side to sell side. This is more easily achieved when you have individual impression level data on both sides. Due to the data access challenges, sometimes we had only groups of impressions, so aggregate data on buy side or sell side, or both. In those situations, sometimes you can still match impressions, but it is much harder. In the event, we were able to match 31 million impressions. Now, in absolute terms, 31 million is a big number. We're very confident that our report conveys what we found. But that is a match rate of only 12%, which is disappointingly low. And obviously, in the scale of all programmatic, 31 million is tiny. So we have been challenged a lot on how we can know if our study is representative of all programmatic. So just to be clear, our study is not representative, and it was never designed to be. It was premium to start with, premium advertisers, premium publishers, the biggest, best-known tech vendors. So it was never designed to be representative. Even within that premium world, we've only been able to match the 12% of impressions with the best data quality. So that makes our findings super premium. Yeah, this is a best of the best scenario that you will see in the next few slides. Moving on to the results. Many of you will recognize this waterfall chart. It was pretty widely reproduced in the trade press when we published our results back in May this year. And what I have now is 1 or 2 slides on each element of that supply chain, finishing with the unknown delta. Just to pause on agency fees, this was never designed to be an exercise in benchmarking agency fees. You don't need a 15-month end-to-end study to do that. What I would say is that although the agencies had different service and fee models, they did end up clustered in quite a narrow range in terms of their effective cost. Where we saw much bigger variation was in the quality of those agency teams. Some of the agency teams we dealt with were truly outstanding, and some were not. So our advice to brands is don't push on the agency fee. There's not much variation there. Instead, be prepared to pay slightly more if necessary in order to secure the best possible agency team, because that's where the real variation lies. We'll now move on to the DSP fees and demand-side tech fees. This is a complex but important chart. There's 18 columns because some of our 15 advertisers used 2 DSPs. The brown bar at the bottom is the DSP fee. That averaged 8% of advertiser spend for the study as a whole. And what you can see is that there's little variation really in that cost. Similarly, ad serving fee, the gray, quite small, quite consistent. Verification fee, that's the use of tools such as Integral Ad Science or Moat or Double Verify, pretty small and consistent. The really interesting part here is the orange bar, which is the use of third-party data. And what you can see there is that some instances, like column 1, not spending anything on third-party data, whereas others, like 5, 6, and 10, spending a quarter of their programmatic budget on third-party data. There's no right or wrong here. This is just different strategies. We would, though, make 3 important points. First, if your strategy is to go heavy on third-party data, as you can see, it can be expensive, so you would want to be very confident it generates a good return on investment. Second, not this work, but other projects my team has done, has generally left us impressed and supportive of high-quality certified publisher first-party data, and somewhat skeptical about the accuracy of third-party data. And finally, as most of you will know, at the end of next year, Google is discontinuing the use of third-party cookies. And inevitably, that means this chart will look very different come 2022. It's a separate topic to today, but we think that this impending change is really significant, and for many marketers will mean investment in 3 things. It will mean investment in their own customer data. It will mean investment in the marketing technology to use that data. and it will mean investment in their own operations to drive maximum value from that data and that MarTech. SSP fees. Quick point to note, in our chart, SSP fees were at 8% of advertiser spend, but the way SSPs contract is with the publisher, which is a much smaller denominator. So in our study, SSP fees averaged 14% of publisher revenue, which is equal to 8% of advertiser spend. Not all, but most SSPs gave us their own fees in the data, and that meant you could compare the fee in the data with the fee written down in the contract. You would hope to see those two things match, as they do in column 2, but as you can also see, more often they didn't, and on average, fees in the data exceeded fees in the contract by 2%. This doesn't mean SSPs are necessarily overcharging. They could be truing up to the contract rate, either over a bigger volume of impressions or through their invoicing process at month end. What it does mean is that if you're a publisher, you should be monitoring carefully what your SSP is charging you to ensure that it does align with the contract. For an advertiser, the same thing would apply for your DSP costs. We did do some peer comparisons of the publishers. Some, like Publisher 4, more effective at getting a greater proportion of spend through to them than others, like Publisher 6. The challenges with data and access and data quality mean it's hard to draw definitive conclusions, but directionally we would say publishers that worked with a smaller number of SSPs were more effective at getting a greater proportion of that spend through to themselves. Of our 31 million impressions, 30 million were not labeled display or video, which reinforces those data quality issues. Of the 18 million that were labeled, the vast majority were display. What we found was more getting through on the video impressions. Intuitively, that makes sense. Smaller volumes of inventory and simpler, better controlled supply chains. As a reminder, by video here, we mean a video impression on a news or magazine website. We don't mean YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, because they weren't part of the study. Similarly, 11 million impressions not labeled open or private. Of the 20 million that were, 18 million were open, 2 million private. More money getting through on the private marketplace. We have been asked a number of times why that differential isn't larger, and that's because our open marketplace is still a super premium scenario, as I talked about earlier. As you move into long tail programmatic, I'm confident the amount getting through in open marketplace would fall, and you'd end up with a bigger differential open versus private. And then we come to the unknown delta. So the unknown delta arises where there's a discrepancy between what the DSP reports as leaving and the amount of money the SSP reports as coming in. And those two things should match. We saw lots of impressions where it did match and the delta was 0. We also saw many impressions where it didn't. The impression with the single biggest delta was at 85% of advertiser spend. The black box you can see there is the second and third quartiles. So that's the middle half of impressions, delta ranging 2 to 23 and averaging 15. We saw deltas in all possible DSP, SSP combinations. The data can't tell us what causes the delta. The data just tells us the delta exists. We do have some suggestions of causes. These have come from our own team, from previous projects, from the tech vendors themselves, and from quiet off-record conversations. So we think that delta represents a combination, certainly some of the limitations in data quality. There might be DSP or SSP fees being applied, but not reported in the study data. Foreign exchange will play a part because this was a study in the UK in pounds sterling, but programmatic tech all operates in US dollars, so you have to do a lot of translating and retranslating. There might be an element of inventory reselling, although generally we think that's a bigger challenge in long tail, not in this premium environment. And there could be other factors. Ultimately, the only way to know for sure is to improve the data access and data quality so you can drill down into that delta and drive it downwards to benefit advertisers and publishers. For me personally, I think that the components of that delta, I mean, we've listed about half a dozen potential causes. I think they each contribute 1 or 2 or 3%, and that 15% is an aggregation effect. In other words, these supply chains are messy. They are not Machiavellian. We did also do some analysis of the use of tools to minimize risks around fraud, viewability, and brand safety. I'm going to focus in here on the penultimate column, inclusion lists, otherwise known as whitelists. Where these are in operation, your ads should only be appearing on a predefined, pre-approved list of sites. 12 of our 15 ran inclusion lists, but despite this, the average number of sites on which our advertisers appeared in a 3-month period in just the UK was nearly 40,000. And this strikes us as a significantly high number. To provide a bit more detail, about half of our advertisers were at 6,000 websites or fewer, which we would regard as good practice. The other half were clustered at 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, and the highest was 150,000. I think it's fair to say that the advertisers in the higher end of that spectrum weren't comfortable with it. And if we were to rerun this study today, I'm confident the average number of sites would be much lower. 2 key recommendations. First, this need for industry-wide collaboration to improve standards of data access and data quality. Once that's in place, you can move to the second recommendation, which is to investigate and drive down that 15% delta for the benefit of advertisers and publishers. I'm conscious that's been a huge amount of information in a short space of time. Looking forward to taking questions, and of course, please do get in touch with me directly at PwC. Many thanks.
Okej, tack ska ni ha. Vi kommer nu sätta över dem i live mode FaceTime. Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, you can. Hello.
Thank you for a very insightful and very meaty presentation, to say the least. I have a number of questions for you. The first obvious question really comes to mind is, why do we need a transparency study at all?
I think I'll answer that briefly before passing to Sam. So we commissioned this study in 2018, primarily because advertisers had a much better understanding of the programmatic supply chain, given its emerging and constant, its emerging maturity over the sort of 6 to 7 years, of which it really had a foothold in the UK. But there were still questions being asked about who is in my supply chain, how much do they cost, so that you can truly derive the return on investment that each partner delivers. So there was a clear understanding that valuable partners, of course, have to charge for their services. And if they deliver, more than deliver on the investment cost with them, then that's absolutely fine. But there was just a lack of understanding about basically how much they charge and who was in their supply chains. So they really wanted, essentially, to boil it down, they wanted the ability to be able to audit and follow the money through the supply chain, and they couldn't do that, and that's why we commissioned it.
I do understand that, but is this applicable in other industries as well? You know, think of it. I mean, I would like to know how much Walmart would pay for the milk, and hence, you know, they have their price, obviously, and I don't get to know that kind of value chain. Why is it so important and relevant in this space?
I think, I'll offer, Tam, do you want to offer perspective first and I'll chip in?
No, you go first as the instigator of the study, and then I'll share some thoughts.
I think that I think let's compare it with other forms of media where auditing and basic financial auditing is a must-have. So if you compare this to a media audit of an agency and clients and the media audits of that is standard. It is standard for auditors to audit and other forms of media and TV, out of home, print in the same fashion. So this is about bringing programmatic to the same standard as other forms of media auditing. It is not holding it to a higher bar. I've seen some arguments talking about fruit sellers, daffodil sellers across the world. And whilst there are interesting comparisons, in various different industries, there are different audits which are commissioned and independent audits, so that you can actually then have standards talking about fair trade, for instance, and there's much more transparent. Rather than just a sticker behind that, there are detailed audits and supply chain audits which underpin that, and standards which people have to achieve to be able to actually achieve that sticker, to actually achieve that standard. So there are, we don't currently have that at the moment, but the focal point here is that this is about bringing programmatic transparency, financial auditing, end-to-end auditing on par with other forms of media.
Yeah, in previously this afternoon we had a local Swedish study where we asked the value chains with regards to their tech investments and also what's the status of the programmatic world in Sweden today. And 75% of the respondees responded that they would actually invest more into tech, and 50% out of the 50 others said that they think they paid too much, whereas the other 50% said that no, what I pay today is fair. When it comes down to it, you got an investor and you got a publisher and you got a lot of parties in between. Obviously the significance of the fact that they want to invest more suggests that they're sort of okay with this. Or how would you, what's your take on that answer from the Swedish echo chain?
So if I share some thoughts on that one, I think if the supply chain is fully transparent, then advertisers can make an informed decision about whether they are happy with where their money is going. I think speaking on behalf of lots of advertisers that we've presented to. So we presented this study almost 90 times now. And I would say the reaction from the vast majority of advertisers was that an ecosystem with only half of their money reaching the publisher was not one that they felt comfortable with. And they wouldn't have been aware prior to this study that only half of their money was getting through. I think it's very hard to agree what the right number is, and I'm not sure there is a right number, but I think most people would agree that only half of the money reaching the publisher doesn't feel appropriate.
Okay, 10 seconds on what's the solution?
Do you want to go first, Steve?
So the solution is we've set up a cross-industry task force to carry forward the 2 findings from the report, which is better access to data, consistent legal access to data, and standardization of terms, and better quality of data. And then once you do that, we can then investigate what's driving this missing 15%. So there's a cross-industry task force. It needs to be international in nature. Would welcome everybody getting on board and offering their thoughts, opinions, and getting stuck into that work. But that work has begun. We're now beginning that in earnest to try to resolve those issues.
Thank you so much, guys. And thank you for being with us this afternoon, and good luck in the future.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.